seasoned traveler. As a freelance writer, she often found herself hopping between hotels for work. But despite her years on the road, nothing could have prepared her for the terror awaiting her at the Langford Inn. Nestled deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, the Langford Inn was the perfect blend of rustic charm and modern amenities, or so the brochure claimed. Ella had heard about it from a fellow traveler who described it as an off-the-beaten-path gem. Tired of cookie-cutter hotel chains, she decided to book a room for a week, hoping the solitude would help her focus on her upcoming deadline. From the moment she arrived, the place felt off. The towering, ivy-covered facade looked more like a Gothic mansion than a cozy inn. As she stepped through the heavy wooden doors, a wave of stale air greeted her. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, with antique furniture scattered haphazardly. A grand chandelier hung precariously overhead, its once elegant crystal pendants coated in dust. A middle-aged woman sat behind the reception desk, her face pale and drawn. She offered Ella a tight, forced smile as she handed over the key to room 214. "Enjoy your stay," the woman said, her voice raspy, as if she'd been whispering for years. Ella offered a polite nod, lugging her suitcase to the ancient elevator at the end of the hallway. It groaned and creaked as it ascended to the second floor, every vibration making her question its reliability. As the doors slid open, a long, narrow hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by flickering sconces that cast eerie shadows on the faded wallpaper. Room 214 was the last door on the left. Ella pushed the key into the lock, feeling the resistance of old mechanisms before the door finally gave way. Inside, the room was surprisingly modern, a king-sized bed with crisp white linens, a flat-screen TV, and a sleek desk in front of a large window overlooking the dense forest. It was a stark contrast to the rest of the hotel, and for a moment she felt at ease. But that sense of comfort didn't last long. Later that evening, as she sat at the desk typing away, she heard it for the first time, a soft tapping sound coming from the other side of the wall. At first, she dismissed it as the hotel settling. Old buildings had a tendency to groan. But the tapping persisted. Steady, rhythmic, tap, tap, tap. It grew louder, more insistent. Ella stood and pressed her ear to the wall, but the moment she did, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly returned to her desk, trying to brush off the noise as her imagination. She worked late into the night, the tapping forgotten, until exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. The next morning, Ella awoke to find something disturbing. Her suitcase had been moved. It was a small detail, but one she couldn't ignore. She distinctly remembered placing it by the door when she arrived, but now it was by the window, its contents slightly spilled out onto the floor. Unease curled in her stomach, but she brushed it off, chalking it up to the fatigue of travel. That day, she spent most of her time exploring the nearby town and grabbing dinner at a local cafe. By the time she returned to the hotel, the sun had set, casting long shadows through the dense forest. The Langford Inn loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the fading light. As she made her way back to her room, Ella noticed something strange. There were no other guests. Not in the lobby, not in the hallways. The eerie silence returned, amplifying the creaking of the floor beneath her feet. But the strangest part was the front desk. The pale woman was gone, and in her place sat a small sign that read, "Back soon." With a knot of unease tightening in her chest, Ella hurried to her room, locking the door behind her. That night, the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from inside her room. Ella froze in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. The tapping stopped, replaced by a soft, barely perceptible scraping sound. She slowly turned her head toward the source of the noise, her suitcase. It was moving. Just a slight, imperceptible shift, but enough to make her blood run cold. Trembling, she threw back the covers and approached it cautiously. The suitcase hadn't been moved far, but it was enough to make her question her own sanity. The scraping grew louder as she neared the suitcase. Taking a deep breath, she crouched down and hesitantly opened it. Nothing. The contents of her bag were just as she'd packed them. Shaking her head, Ella zipped it shut and stood up, her nerves frayed. Maybe she was just tired, maybe it was all in her head. But the moment she turned her back to the suitcase, a soft voice whispered, "Help me." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, eyes wide, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Panic set in, and she rushed to the door, fumbling with the lock. Just as she flung it open, she froze. In the hallway, standing just beyond the threshold, was the woman from the front desk. Her once pale face was now gaunt, her skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, her lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman whispered, her voice no longer raspy but guttural, like nails scraping over stone. "He doesn't like visitors." Before Ella could react, the woman lunged at her. Cold hands grasped her arms, pulling her into the hallway. Ella screamed, struggling to free herself, but the woman's grip was impossibly strong. She was dragged down the hallway, past room after room, each door slightly ajar, revealing dark, empty spaces within. As they reached the end of the hall, Ella caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, a figure, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by darkness. "He's been waiting for you," the woman hissed. With a final desperate scream, Ella broke free from the woman's grasp and bolted down the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground. She burst through the front doors, into the cold night air, and didn't stop running until she reached her car. She never looked back. The next morning when she returned with the police, the Langford Inn was gone. There was no building, no sign of the towering structure that had loomed over the forest just hours before. Only an empty lot remained, overgrown with weeds and vines. Ella never wrote about what happened to her at the Langford Inn. Some stories, she decided, were too terrifying to share. Ella thought she had escaped the clutches of the Langford Inn, but the memory lingered like a haunting refrain. Back in her apartment, she tried to reclaim her routine, but the mundane buzz of city life felt foreign and stifling. Every creak of her floorboards reminded her of that night, and shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in her corners. She kept expecting to see the gaunt woman, or the ominous figure lurking just out of sight. A few weeks later, as autumn leaves began to fall, Ella received an unexpected package. It was an unmarked envelope, crinkled and worn. Inside, she found a small tarnished key attached to a note that read, "Come back. We're waiting." Her heart raced. The handwriting was familiar, though it took her a moment to place it. It was the same spidery script she had seen on the guest registration form at the Langford Inn. Determined to put an end to her nightmares, Ella found herself standing at the entrance of the inn again, though it appeared different this time. The ivy was denser, the windows blacker, and the air felt thicker. The road that had led to it was overgrown, as if nature was attempting to reclaim the space. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The lobby looked as she remembered, yet an uncanny stillness enveloped the room. The receptionist was gone, but the same heavy silence loomed over her, thick enough to cut through. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing against the walls. No response, just the sound of her own heartbeat thrumming in her ears. Ella hesitated, but then made her way up to room 214. The hallway seemed longer this time, shadows creeping along the walls, stretching and shifting as if alive. She inserted the key into the lock, her hand trembling as the mechanism clicked open. The room was unchanged, but there was a chilling air about it. She stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind her with a soft thud. With a determination fueled by fear, Ella began to search the room, convinced there was something she missed during her last visit. She rifled through her suitcase again, then turned her attention to the desk. Papers scattered across the surface. A few were blank, but some were filled with cryptic notes. "He is always watching. The walls listen. You must find the heart." As she read the last note, the air grew colder. Ella turned, and there it was again. The soft tapping sound. It resonated from the wall beside her, louder and more insistent this time. A heartbeat echoing through the silence. "Help me," the voice whispered again, this time clearer and more desperate. She pressed her ear to the wall, panic flooding her senses. The tapping continued, but now she could hear something else, a low, mournful wail that sent chills coursing through her. Gathering her courage, she grabbed a nearby lamp and began to pound on the wall, her heart racing. "What do you want?" she shouted, the sound of her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. The wall responded with a sudden thud, vibrating under her hand, and then it cracked open, as if a hidden door was being revealed. The opening was small, just big enough for her to peer through. Inside, she saw a narrow, dark corridor. The walls were lined with photographs, faded images of past guests, their faces obscured by shadow. Ella's breath hitched when she recognized one of them. The pale woman from the front desk, a smile plastered across her face as if she were posing for a happy memory. She squeezed through the opening and into the corridor, her heart pounding. As she stepped into the darkness, the air became thick with a rancid scent like decay. The corridor wound deeper, lit by flickering lights that barely illuminated the way. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls. "Help us," they pleaded, overlapping in a chorus of anguish. Ella pressed on, drawn by an inexplicable urge to discover the source of the cries. The corridor opened into a vast room, its ceiling lost in shadow. The air felt electric, crackling with an otherworldly energy. In the center stood an altar, covered in dust and surrounded by black candles, their wax melted and hardened in grotesque shapes. Atop the altar was a heart, a real beating heart, pulsating with life despite being surrounded by death. It was encased in glass, and a strange light glowed from within it, casting eerie shadows across the room. Ella stumbled back, horror gripping her. The whispers surged, urging her to come closer, to take the heart. "You must free us," they cried, growing frantic. "No," she shouted, shaking her head. "I won't do it." But the heart seemed to call to her, and she felt drawn to it, as if it held the key to her nightmares. As she stepped closer, the shadows began to swirl, forming into the gaunt figure she had glimpsed before. Its eyes were hollow, filled with a void that seemed to consume the light around it. "You've come back," it rasped, its voice echoing through the chamber. "You are meant to be here." Ella felt an overwhelming sense of dread, her instincts screaming at her to flee. She turned, but the corridor had vanished, replaced by walls that closed in around her. The only way forward was through the figure. "What do you want?" she yelled, her voice trembling. "Release the heart," it hissed, "and join us." A surge of anger mixed with fear coursed through Ella. "I won't be a part of this." She grabbed a nearby candle, thrusting it at the figure, but it simply absorbed the flame as if mocking her. "Your fear binds you to this place. Embrace it," it whispered. Ella's heart raced as she realized the truth. The heart was the essence of all who had come to the Langford Inn, bound by their fears, their regrets, and their sorrows. If she released it, they would be free. But what would happen to her? A thought struck her. "What if I don't release it?" she shouted defiantly. "What if I choose to leave?" The figure lunged at her, its form shifting, and the shadows erupted into a cacophony of tortured faces, crying out in unison. "You cannot escape. We will always be here." In that moment, a surge of determination fueled Ella. She reached for the glass case, her heart pounding in her chest. With a swift motion, she smashed the glass with the candle, the sound echoing like thunder in the chamber. The heart, freed, began to pulse wildly, emitting a blinding light that engulfed everything. The shadows shrieked, twisting and writhing as the light expanded. Ella felt a rush of energy as the light consumed the darkness, and she was thrown back, landing hard against the floor. When the light faded, she found herself back in room 214. The walls were still, the tapping silence returning, but the atmosphere felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Ella scrambled to her feet and rushed to the door. The hallway was empty, the air clear of the suffocating dread she had felt before. With one final glance back at the room, she bolted down the corridor, down the stairs, and out of the Langford Inn. As she stumbled into the daylight, she took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She turned to look back, half expecting to see the hotel looming behind her. Instead, she found only the sprawling forest, untouched and serene. Ella never spoke of what she experienced in the Langford Inn, but she felt its echoes linger in her heart. She had faced the darkness, confronted her fears, and emerged stronger. And though the hotel was gone, she knew it would never truly fade from her memory. A reminder of the ghosts that can haunt us, even in the places we least expect.